Welcome everyone to this new episode of MoLab Conversation. Today we are going to discuss a new theme in our MoLab inventory, which is tentatively named Linked Mobilities. By linked mobilities, I'm thinking the interlinkage between the movement of people, movement of things, movement of information, and energy, and all kinds of natural resources. In a way, of course, this is rather banal. I mean, the mobility of people, mobility of things are always connected. But I think there is at least three things are relatively new and deserve some scholarly attention. Number one, we witnessed that more and more conscious efforts in the world are being made to link these different mobilities together. It can be government, it can be corporations, and also in artistic communities, people now try to different ways to bring these different mobilities together. Secondly, we are thinking that by linking these different mobilities together, it will enable us to see something we did not see before. For example, it will help us to interpret history in new ways, because in the history, different mobilities are always interconnected in different ways, but there's a particular way how they are interconnected may change. And thirdly, we think it's worth exploring the linked mobilities because methodological concerns, how can we put the movement of people and the movement of natural resources in a coherent framework and to say something new, useful for policy debates and also for public actions. So today I'm very pleased to be joined with our visiting fellow, Julia Morris. And Julia, can you introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor of international studies at University of North Carolina Wilmington, where I've been for the last 2 years, and over in Halle at the Max Planck Institute, just finishing off my book project. I'm very grateful to be here.
Great. And I understand that in your book you talk about the entanglement between resources and the movement of resources and the movement of people. Yeah. That is obviously related to our concern about linked mobilities. Can you tell us what triggered you to look at things from that angle and what kind of added value it may offer, this particular way of looking at the mobilities?
So I was initially interested in thinking about the commodification of human mobility and the commodification of migration. And when I did my fieldwork in the Republic of Nauru, which is a 21 kilometers squared island, it's northeast of Papua New Guinea in the Pacific, Nauru has these two very stark industry projects, and I was conceptualizing both as industry projects. The first one is much easier to conceptualize as an industry project, which is around phosphate. So Nauru has a colonial phosphate industry and an involvement in the extraction, the exportation of phosphate for processing, for circulation through global food systems, eventually as fertilizer. And I then saw quite how starkly this was a way to make visible Nauru's latest post-colonial industry project around the processing of people and the refugee industry, whereby the Australian government has contracted the Nauruan government into working with them around the processing and the resettlement of migrants as refugees in the country. And I found that this was initially a very powerful way to make clear quite how starkly the institutionalized system of asylum assessment has become an industry and an industry that governs where people can move. And then as I continued doing fieldwork in Nauru, I found a lot of entanglements between these two industries and ways in which Nauruans, from having had these histories of colonial extractivism, were then conceptualizing refugees through a practice of extractivism, and also thinking about the ways in which temporalities came together. So reasons why Nauruans had this dwindling colonial phosphate industry, and how that then made the local government think about the utility of having this future industry. And these entanglements were very stark in how people conceptualized refugees as commodities. So it didn't move far beyond just being a metaphorical parallel into one in which I saw these entanglements between migrants and minerals essentially really come together.
I see. So the entanglement, I mean, the core of the entanglement, it seems to be a local conception. If I understand it correctly, is because the historical memory of being a colonized and resource town now really shape their current understanding about refugee processing the industry. Is my understanding correct? Yeah.
Yeah, understandings and ways in which, in many respects, the refugee industry was quite easy to facilitate in the country because the entire country was a company town. As a country, 21 kilometers squared. So very easy for things like legal and governance structures that had initially been shaped around phosphate as a resource to then find their way into being shaped around humans as a resource. And school curricula, for example, that was around phosphate, then being reshaped around refugees. So a lot of ways in which one industry kind of provided a palimpsest for another to then sature into it and to then become much more facilitable, these sort of patterns of imperial debris that you see.
I see. I suppose that the blueprint was there, the kind of institutional infrastructure was there, ready for the commodification of human mobilities. I mean, here probably I jump a bit to a kind of theoretical point. It is so interesting. For me, it is a kind of a new interpretation of a colonial legacy, right? I mean, Nauru now formally is no longer a colony, is an independent sovereignty. But as a colonial blueprint was so deeply ingrained, actually it shaped the current perception of its own position in the world, and particularly in relation to these refugee flows. Is anything you want to say about how shall we reinterpret the colonialism from your case?
I mean, I think with Nauru, there was the creation of a mono-economy initially around resources, and that in many respects made this new industry project much easier to facilitate. And so thinking about these imperial legacies and these reshaping of legal governance structures, economic structures, and how that then allows for new post-colonial projects to emerge and to be very facilitable, or for countries also to be entangled in dependencies too, where they're very reliant on post-colonial extractive projects to then be outsourced, or these mobile workforces to then come in and to create, to reshape that country in line with new forms of extraction. So I think really important to think about these colonial, post-colonial patterns and continuities that emerge, and to think about ways of perhaps disrupting those.